Every 4 years when the Olympics is on, I become a bit of an expert in gymnastics, and I start waxing lyrical on dismounts and execution and something called the Yurchenko vault. In the past 18 months, we've all become, expert epidemiologists, waxing lyrical about case fatality rates, pathogenicity, and latency periods. But let's face it, the vast majority of us are just armchair experts, and we need real epidemiologists to help us navigate through the emerging data that has bombarded us through the COVID pandemic. Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz, also known as the health nerd, is completing his PhD at the University of Wollongong. He's been involved in uncovering scientific fraud and misconduct throughout the pandemic, and his Twitter feed is a hugely valuable resource as he highlights and breaks down dubious health research. So today he's going to be presenting to us on the topical example of the research that's been used to support the drug Ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Joe. It's great to be here. And fun to end the day, and I think actually fantastic to follow Jan's talk, which I think just made a note that he said that he's more skeptical of scientific studies than the average person. I think my talk perhaps will touch on why it is a good idea to sometimes be more skeptical than the average person of scientific studies. I'm Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz. I'm completing my PhD at the University of Wollongong. I also work as an epidemiologist in New South Wales. For the last 2 years, I've been doing research on COVID. For the last 6 months, somehow my life has become largely about ivermectin, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. It is genuinely one of the most amazing and slightly terrifying stories that I've ever been a part of or heard, and I hope you enjoy. So, okay, the clicking is working. Fantastic. Let's go back to the right bit. Great. I've got my tech issues right up front, so hopefully no more from here on in. I'm basically going to be going through a little bit of where ivermectin started, what happened, the crazy stuff that happened. I guess some of the pseudoscience, some of the really skeptical elements there, and where we are now after just a truly staggering amount of fraud has kind of entered the sphere. So the first place that we start off, if you can take your mind back several centuries to the beginning of April 2020, April the 3rd to be exact, Monash University released a study and released a press release that was very big, finding that ivermectin had some activity against SARS-CoV-2 in a petri dish in a lab. At the time, it was quite exciting. Ivermectin is, for those who are not aware, an anti-parasitic medication that's used to treat worm infections. So it treats river blindness and filariasis and scabies. In Australia, it is used. It's licensed by the TGA. It is a very safe and effective medication, and particularly, it is one of the safest medications that we have, also one of the most effective medications we have for treating parasitic infections. So the World Health Organization gives out ivermectin as part of its mass drug administration programs in Africa and some other low-income countries, and genuinely gives out about 500 million doses of the drug a year. That's the sort of safety profile we're talking about. There are very few medications that are used more commonly in the world than ivermectin. It's fantastic. And so the idea that it would be effective against COVID was quite encouraging. Although at the start of April, I don't know if you can remember back quite that far when all of us were centuries younger, but the ivermectin was one of dozens of drugs where there were in vitro studies demonstrating some level of efficacy. I will say, however, that the staying power of ivermectin, for reasons we'll discuss, has been remarkable. And that's in part because of this study. So this study that Monash University published, when I checked on November the 9th, it had been cited 1,634 times. As of this morning, when I checked again, it was 1,655 times, which is about 10 citations a week. It's probably going to end up being one of the most cited scientific studies of the last decade. Which is truly remarkable for an in vitro piece of research that is less than 1,000 words long. The one thing, before I get to Surgisphere, actually, I just think it's important to note a key theme of my talk is that ivermectin, unlike a lot of other scientific debacles of the last 2 years, is not an issue where you can necessarily say that there was, prior to July 2021 at least, that it was total pseudoscience. Prior to some of the fraud being realized, I think it's important to note that a lot of people held genuine beliefs that ivermectin works, and those, while sometimes were probably wrong and probably not well-founded, they weren't crazy. They weren't completely out there. It's not like they were believing that the spike protein of the virus in a vaccination would give you magical access to 5G. It's not that level of pseudoscience or misbelief, although I think now it has developed to that point. Just wanted to put that in your minds early as we go through. So after the initial study that was published on April the 3rd by Monash University, the next big event was on April the 19th. Surgisphere put up a preprint on the server SSRN. Now, Surgisphere is most famous for papers in the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet, which are two of the biggest medical journals in the world. They were a company that in April and May 2020 claimed that they had access to a huge database of hundreds of thousands of patients, and that they were looking at the drugs these people were getting, and identifying which drugs were effective and ineffective against COVID. Turns out that they almost certainly didn't have any database and that the whole thing was an elaborate fraud. The two articles in NEJM and the Lancet got a lot of international attention when they were withdrawn. This preprint, however, which was on SSRN, didn't get quite the attention. And that was because, or at least didn't get the same attention in Australia. The reason was because it wasn't as popular. It was about ivermectin. It said that ivermectin had a 70% benefit or 80% benefit on mortality for people with COVID. Now, the reason why that wasn't quite as popular, I guess, in some more developed countries was because we had other treatment modalities, we had options. But in South America, particularly, governments and serious, epidemiologists, health experts saw this and made decisions based on this preprint. They implemented ivermectin protocols. They started giving ivermectin to citizens, saying, well, it's quite effective, based on this preprint of 600,000 people, obviously fake preprint, but nevertheless. And it is definitely safe. We have a lot of it on hand, so it probably won't hurt that much. Now, they reversed all these protocols in August when the study was withdrawn and the fraud was revealed. But at that point, as we all know, it was already too late. As with all of these things, once the lie has gotten out, it is extraordinarily hard to put it back in the box. And at this point, huge numbers of other scientists across the world decided, well, ivermectin looks promising, let's trial it. Let's have a go and see if it works. In the scant few months that the SSRN preprint was online, dozens of trials were registered in clinicaltrials.gov, which is the United States National Institute for Health trial registration database. And up till now, more than 80 trials registered. It's a huge field of research. And towards the end of 2020, what we started to see was these trials returning results. And to put it simply, the trials that returned results seemed to say that ivermectin was incredibly beneficial. So this trial found that ivermectin resulted in an almost complete clinical cure for the people who got ivermectin within 3 days, and people who didn't get ivermectin had almost no benefit whatsoever. So, massive difference. If anyone's familiar with Cohen's d, it's a measure of the effect size. A Cohen's d of between 0 and 0.5 is considered relatively small. Between 0.5 and 1 is big. Above 1 is huge. This study reported a Cohen's d of 3.2 between the groups, which is genuinely unheard of in most clinical research and is usually a calculation error. And the sorts of studies that were being revealed had some red flags for quality. They didn't report allocation concealment properly. They had the sort of thing that someone like me, experts in clinical trials, might consider to be a bit of an issue, some sources of bias, but they did appear to, at the very least, be randomized trials that found massive results. And even if there were some sources of bias, you don't expect to see 95% benefits reversed due to allocation concealment issues. It's usually just attenuates the effect rather than eliminating it entirely. So people started to get very, very excited. This was when we started to see things like this trial, which is the Niai et al. Trial. Niai et al. Found a 70% mortality benefit for ivermectin, and the El-Ghazar trial, I believe, which is found a 90% benefit for ivermectin on mortality. So in other words, they randomized people into two groups. In the group that received ivermectin, 2 out of 200 people died. In the group that didn't receive ivermectin, 20 out of 200 people died, which is genuinely massive. Now, if you've been following the news, you'll know that there are some issues here. The next part of our story after these trials came out, before I get to those issues, the next part of the story is that serious, genuine scientists started putting together meta-analyses where they took these studies and they said, well, they've got some issues, but if you aggregate them into a model, you find dramatic efficacy, huge benefits, moderate. This is the Bryant et al. Meta-analysis. This meta-analysis is the probably the most read meta-analysis ever published. I would say that's quite likely. It has the highest altmetric score of any meta-analysis. It's been shared tens of thousands of times on various social media platforms. It may not be the most cited scientific work, but it is certainly, or very likely the one most read by the lay public. And they found, so these two studies that I had up in my previous slide, Niai and El-Ghazar, which found these drastic benefits. While they didn't say, this is the risk of bias rating table, red is bad, yellow is unclear, and green is good. They found that those studies were unclear in some regards, but generally pretty good. That was what they said. And that lent a great deal of legitimacy to the idea that ivermectin worked. Now, this is where the story, I guess, gets a bit murkier. So then in the next part of our saga, we have the El-Ghazar study and its retraction. So basically, this study was fake. I mean, we can discuss precisely what the issues with the study. What I've got on my slide is an example of plagiarism. The entire methods section the entire introduction, part of the methods and some of the discussion was just directly plagiarized without attribution to previous clinical trials. The authors had uploaded a data file online. A tenacious medical student named Jack Lawrence from the United Kingdom managed to both download and gain access to the data set and found that there were serious errors throughout. And on closer analysis, basically there were copy-pasted patients. The data file that the authors said was the file that on which the data for their study was stored was not real clinical data. There were also, even just within the study itself, there were impossible standard deviations that mathematically couldn't really exist. Research Square, which is the preprint server that the study was hosted on, has withdrawn the study almost immediately. I mean, given that a lot of it is plagiarized, they're probably quite worried about legal challenges, if nothing else. And the study has been widely discredited and almost certainly never happened, or at least never happened as described. And this was, at the time, the single biggest clinical trial of ivermectin, and it had the most positive results of any clinical trial of ivermectin. So if you take this study out of those meta-analytic models, which if I go back a couple slides, this Bryant et al. Meta-analysis, moderate certainty evidence. Well, if you take out the El-Ghazar study, the certainty is completely removed and the benefits almost completely disappear. Just this one trial. That has a huge impact. So I've got that in my next slide, I think. So if you replicate Bryant et al., if you just put together the same Dersimonian and layered random effects model, this is what you get. You can see down at the bottom, that's the effect estimate. It says 0.38 with a confidence interval that ranges, and it's very much statistically significant. If all you do is you remove El-Ghazar, you find that the confidence interval now almost touches 1, which is your kind of point of no significance. And perhaps more importantly, the entire benefit rests on this one other study called Niai et al. From Iran. This study has its own very significant issues. Even Bryant et al. Rated it, as unclear risk of bias for several domains. Usually it's not the sort of scientific evidence we'd rely on when making clinical decisions. So I guess this is where we kind of, for a moment, pause in terms of our story and talk about the pseudoscience, the deeply untrue or perhaps the deeply worrisome elements of ivermectin and how it's kind of infiltrated the world. So alongside people who you could argue to some extent were legitimate scientists, although whether they still remain legitimate is perhaps in question in some cases, there were a lot of efforts to push ivermectin as a drug from people who may not have had the same scientific aims. Anyone who has ever looked into ivermectin online or discussed it online will have been linked to this website. This is ivmmeta.com. It is a network of totally anonymous websites that have remarkably good, they've taken a great deal of time and effort both to set up the websites and hide who they are. They have no information about their funding except to say that they have no conflicts of interest, but they have enough time and effort to set up 30, 40 web pages, to pay all the licensing fees for those websites, to pay website designers, to get graphics. So it's just a bit of a bizarre situation. Either it's large groups of people who've spent a great deal of their time setting up websites for free, or someone is paying for it all. Who knows which one, because we don't know who they are. And all of these websites across the board, there's vitamin D meta, there's vitamin C meta, there's metformin meta. They find every time that these pills and supplements are massively effective for the condition for COVID-19. And in this case, IVM meta is no different. They claim that there's a giant benefit for ivermectin and that it's very clear. And they do this in a fairly transparently pseudoscientific way. The problem is that it's transparently pseudoscientific to someone like me, to someone who appraises evidence for their job. To the average layperson who's reading this sort of website, it appears very legitimate. It is flashy, it is well done, and regardless of what you think about the motivations of the people behind this and who might be paying them, the fact is that they are incredibly good at getting their message across. Absolutely. They have put a great deal of time, effort, and money into their website to make it really, really well designed. You have to applaud whoever's behind it, who will not admit to their identities. The other things you've got, and I think this IVM Meta website, they have studies on there, and the way that they get this massive benefit for ivermectin is by taking every study that has ever been published, no matter how shockingly awful, and throwing it into one meta-analytic model. A meta-analytic model, the Dursimonian and Laird meta-analytic model, which is what they use, random effects model. Basically, it's just a weighted average. So you take your mean, where you just put all the numbers together and divide by n, and you weight each number based on the confidence intervals of the point estimate. So you get you're weighting each study, so that the bigger studies in theory will provide more weight to your model, and the smaller studies will provide less weight. And so the studies that you put in define the figures that you find. And they have, for example, on their website, this Carvalho et al. Study. This study has been investigated both by myself and a few other people. The hospitals that the authors say were involved claim never to have heard of the study. The authors have several different timelines, all of which contradict their own stated research that's been published. It's in what I can only call the most predatory journal I've ever seen. This study almost certainly didn't happen, or if it did happen, it certainly didn't happen as described. It is still up on ivmmeta.com. They have no interest in removing it because it's very positive. They've got this study, Babalola et al. Babalola et al. Has numerous numeric mistakes in the text. They say that they tested people every 3.5 days, but that cannot possibly be true given the averages they report. And they say that they have 50% of 21 people. So presumably they had 50% of 21 people had hypertension, which means that they had a torso, someone sliced down the middle, hopping around as part of their patient group. Obviously they didn't. The study has very, very significant errors, mistakes, and probably shouldn't be included in any meta-analytic model. They also have things like this on ivmmeta.com, which It's just wonderful. They say this is a Ivor prep, I believe. They give it a fancy name. This is a tweet by an anonymous account with a slide in Spanish. That is the reference to a study on ivmmeta.com. I emailed one of the team behind the study in Argentina that this slide comes from, and he said, no, only a charlatan would use that. It was just a slide that we made to justify our study, or to give the reasons why we actually did our study in the first place. And their study found negative, or found null results. They found no benefit for ivermectin. But the slide from a presentation that they once gave, which was kept online and then retweeted by a totally anonymous account, has been put up on IVM Meta because, well, they have no shame. So the other elements of pseudoscience, and I think this is again where we get into this thing where a rational, reasonable layperson could easily be drawn into it. You've got organizations like the British Ivermectin Response Development Group. I mean, in the name, they've got ivermectin. They clearly believe it works. Tess Laurie, who's the head of this organization, has said that she cannot possibly be convinced that ivermectin doesn't work. It definitely works in her opinion. And Bird, as just one example, currently contains lies about me and about other people on their blog. They host a number of things that are just very easily demonstrably untrue. And I think, but again, it's a very flashy website. They've got a very large donate button in the corner, and it looks on face value legitimate. Most of the people involved are people who you would listen to in terms of science before the pandemic. Similarly, FLCCC, the Frontline Critical Care Coalition, I believe the C's stand for, they're an organization that now has essentially become an ivermectin pushing association. They say things like the World Health Organization is in the pocket of Bill Gates, and they use spurious statistics to push this fact. They believe that Bill Gates is the primary donor to the World Health Organization, despite that not actually being accurate. They say things like, yeah, because the World Health Organization believes the UN's investigation into the impacts of Chernobyl, which involved a series of large epidemiological studies over the course of about a decade, because the World Health Organization accepts those findings, they are in the pocket of big something. Big who? No one knows. Big who, I guess, the World Health Organization. That's a terrible pun. I apologize to everyone watching. Both Bird and the FLCCC appear to have become increasingly anti-vaccine. FLCCC, for example, is currently hosting this letter, this explicitly anti-vaccine letter, which argues basically that vaccines are unnecessary for anyone who doesn't want them, and says no one should get a vaccine in very kind of plain language. So I think one of the things, I don't like to litigate people's intentions. I don't know why anyone does the things they do, but what has been observable is organizations that accepted ivermectin based on what you could legitimately say in January, February, April of 2021, before studies started being demonstrated as fraud. Scientists don't look for fraud on the whole. We don't consider that someone might be faking research. And so you could say that it was a reasonable belief that these studies, although flawed, were pointing towards ivermectin being effective. And in that kind of evidence space, promoting ivermectin, which, as I've mentioned, is a safe and effective drug, does make some sense. Perhaps you could argue that they were even then too quick to jump the gun. They were saying things based on evidence that was poor, and they should have been more cautious. But at that point, they were making relatively reasonable statements based on the evidence at hand. Now, with the strong anti-vaccine elements in both of these organizations, particularly FLCCC, and the positions they've taken on other things, I think we can reasonably say that there is a much more of a movement away from a kind of scientific basis and more towards anti-establishment, anti-vaccine, anti-scientific beliefs. I'm not going to go through every study. This is just a quick list of some of the studies with very, very serious issues. Niai et al., which I mentioned earlier, we've now identified that it cannot possibly have been randomized. I've seen the data that the authors collected, and it doesn't look like data from a real clinical trial. All of this is covered in detail in my blogs, and also from some other members of the team, Dr. Carl Sheldrick, who's a doctor from the University of New South Wales, and finishing his PhD, and then James Heathers and Nick Brown and Jack Lawrence, as well as BuzzFeed, Melissa Davey from The Guardian, and a number of other publications have all covered this in detail. So I suggest you read those if you want more. But I will very quickly do something fun, because I thought you'd all appreciate it. This is a study that I haven't called out publicly before. And I'm just going to very quickly run you through a couple of issues with this study. This is hosted on ivmmeta.com, of course. It is, I would say, immensely terrible research, even at face value. It's published in a medical journal that looks deeply predatory. A predatory journal, just for anyone who's not aware, is a journal that essentially accepts money to say that they've peer-reviewed studies, even if they haven't. They are bastions for terrible research. So this study, which I was looking at recently, it ultimately described itself as cross-sectional and randomized in the methods, which is not a good sign, because randomized trials have to be prospective. You have to recruit people and then follow them over time. They cannot take place at one point in time. It doesn't describe allocation concealment, doesn't describe how they randomize their participants, which are really important things for any randomized clinical trial. And then even when you go through the data, you've got this table. This table has at least one, I think 2 or 3, but at least one numeric mistake that cannot possibly be true. I'll give you, let's say, 10 seconds to see if you can find the numeric mistake, because it is a relatively hard one to find. I didn't actually notice this. Kyle noticed this first. Some of the standard deviations are, if not impossible, then extraordinarily unlikely. And some scientists who do a lot of this might notice that they're far too narrow to be true. But if you look closely, I'm going to ruin it for anyone who's still looking. That number can't be true. 10.12. In a group of people who had 9 to 10 days of symptoms, so this was measuring how long they had symptoms for, cannot possibly have an average above 10. In that group, it can't be true. So either it's 9 to 10 plus days, or they included people who'd had symptoms for more than 10 days in their 9 to 10 day group. And so that's not the sort of thing that you expect to see in a scientific study. You don't expect to see numbers that cannot possibly be true. It is just immensely flawed and problematic, and no one should be using it as evidence for anything. And that led a group, the group that I've talked about, myself, Jack Lawrence, James Heathers, Nick Brown, and Kyle Sheldrick, to publish this letter in Nature Medicine. If you're interested, have a look, have a read. Basically, what we say is that meta-analyses should start incorporating new methods where we actually say, well, what if the studies are fraudulent, and start basing our analysis on that opinion, and asking authors who've published randomized trials for their data so that we can do tests which allow us to examine whether these studies were fake. And yeah, because if you don't do that, you will be accepting a certain level of fraud. And when we're talking about treatments in a pandemic, that's something of an issue. So I thought I'd go back to this study, to this slide. If you remember this meta-analysis from 20 minutes ago when I was talking about it before, Bryant et al., the most read meta-analysis of all time, as far as I can tell, it should probably be retracted, almost certainly. If you take out the 2 studies that I've discussed, Niai and El-Ghazar, there is no benefit for ivermectin. And I'll show you this now. Sorry, I may have moved that slide slightly later in the presentation. Let me just say, so this is getting back to the point I made right at the start. I think a reasonable, legitimate person who maybe doesn't have very deep scientific knowledge, who read Bryant et al., who looked at ivmmeta.com, could legitimately believe that ivermectin works, and not through any malfeasance on their part, but just because the evidence is quite convincing to people who don't interrogate it very deeply. And that brings us to a kind of a difficult situation, and I think perhaps a moment of reckoning in terms of what we as skeptics do and how we communicate science, because it is very difficult for us to say trust the science when reasonable, legitimate at least legitimate before the pandemic, scientists have been saying ivermectin works, and they've been publishing studies in legitimate journals, which are very widely read, saying that ivermectin works. And ivermectin is safe and it is effective for parasites. We don't want people to stop taking ivermectin for parasites because many of the alternatives are not as good. It is genuinely one of the most important medications in the world for parasitic infections, not for COVID. And I think I'm guilty of this as well. So this, I put up a tweet on this slide that I made. It is hilarious. Mector-Ivan, dehorse your worms. Very funny joke. But it is also probably a bit unhelpful. And to some extent, I regret that, because I think we've, a lot of the focus, like the FDA tweeting you're not horses, you'll stop it, right? That's unhelpful because a lot of the people who've been approaching the ivermectin question have been doing so in good faith, thinking that they were engaging with the science, and really they've been conned. And it's very easy for us to just make fun of them. It is much harder for us to engage with them and to deal with the underlying issues. So where are we now? This is the Bryant et al. Meta-analysis, but taking out those problematic, two very problematic trials, as well as one other trial, which I didn't mention, Akumas et al., which has genuinely massive issues as well. And I mean, I'm not going to say it's fake, but it is very significantly worrying. If you take those trials out of your meta-analysis of randomized control trials, you add in a few new studies. So the Vallejos et al. Study, which came out after the Bryant et al. Meta-analysis, the Together trial, which is unpublished, but they've released their results, and the ITEC trial, which is a Malaysian study of about 500 people, which reported results a few weeks ago. If you add those into the model, you find basically that ivermectin has a benefit, has an impact consistent with both benefit and harm. The point estimate very much crosses 1, and so there is no way to tell if ivermectin works for the treatment of COVID-19. It does appear to be very unlikely that it will, but it may still have benefits. So the sorts of benefits promoted by Bird and FLCCC, that ivermectin can end the pandemic tomorrow, absolutely untrue, almost certainly nonsense, or certainly nonsense. We may still find a benefit of something like 10-20% in mortality, which would still be significant because ivermectin is, as I said, quite a safe medication, but certainly not the sort of thing that's going to end the pandemic tomorrow, and absolutely not a reason not to get vaccinated. And potentially also could end up being harmful. And that's actually what we found with hydroxychloroquine, which is in a similar situation. And this has led the Cochrane collaboration to say in their review of the matter, this is Pop et al., that ivermectin shouldn't be used outside of randomized clinical trials. And that is, I think, the most reasonable position to hold until at least the beginning of next year. We should have two very large studies, very large, well-funded studies, the Principal and the Active 6 trial, reporting their interim results. When those come in, which will involve thousands of people, we probably have a definitive answer to whether ivermectin works or not. I'm not holding my breath. I'm not super hopeful that it will work, but it may, and that would be a very major finding. So I think that's basically the end of the story from my perspective until these new trials come out. I think these are the things that I really think about this. How do you cope with pseudoscience when the pseudoscience is partly fakery within science? How do we as skeptics deal with that? And then how do you talk about, how do we grapple with the fact that someone who has absolutely no idea how to appraise evidence, but who is following what they consider to be the science, might reasonably believe that ivermectin works? And how do we convince them that the science is not as simple as they've been led to believe? And I think that's the end of my talk. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, so I think that's about right. Yeah.
We've got plenty of time for questions.
Wonderful.
And that's great because there's a lot of questions.
Brilliant. I hoped people would be interested in talking about ivermectin, but you never know. It's the end of a long day, and ivermectin is honestly such a tired story by now.
You would
for
think
me.
so, yeah, and yet it keeps rearing its head. So, so let's jump straight in, and thank you for a fascinating talk. So, question from James Milton: at what point do you look at studies like those done on ivermectin that you say that even if there is a positive outcome, given how hard it was to find, that it has to be, sorry, I'm hoping I'm communicating this well, that it has to be, using a lay definition, insignificant?
I think, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Are we saying that if there is a very small positive benefit, at what point do we not care?
Yeah, I think the question is asking that, you know, even if there is a positive outcome, given that if you kind of had to look really hard for that outcome, how do we call it as being insignificant, even if there's some positivity?
I think with ivermectin, the interesting point is that there probably isn't a level at which it would be clinically insignificant to find a benefit. It genuinely is quite a safe medication. I mean, if you're taking 8 to 10 times the recommended dose, which is what the FLCCC currently recommends, it may not be as safe as people think, but in its usual dosages, it is genuinely a very safe medication. Even a 5% benefit would probably be clinically significant and used in the treatment of COVID-19.
Okay, great. All right. Now, I'm actually not sure who these questions come from, so they may all not. I don't know. So, how can we as lay people determine what news articles about new research are actually worth paying attention to and treating as new, correct-ish information?
Honestly, it is very hard. I've been grappling with that question for years as a scientist. I help several journalists. I talk to journalists a lot, kind of off the record, just to help them understand scientific studies. And I think, to be honest, it's hard to say. There are some publications that generally do scientific reporting very well, like The Atlantic. But the biggest thing I found is the journalists themselves. So like Melissa Davey from The Guardian, Liam Mannix from The Age. There used to be a fantastic editor, Mia de Graaf, at the Daily Mail, ironically, but she's since moved to Business Insider. And so now if you read something by her in Business Insider, it's great. There's Stephanie Lee at BuzzFeed. I could go on, but basically the key I found is firstly the journalist. Secondly, it's always good to check the study yourself. See if they've described the study, the scientist that they're reporting on accurately. That's a big marker, because often the bad headlines will not describe the actual research that they're relating to. A great example, which Jan, I think, mentioned, is if they don't say they're in mice, but they're in mice. There's a great Twitter account run by James Heathers, who's one of the ivermectin people that I was talking about, called Just Says in Mice, and he just tweets out in mice. Very funny.
Wonderful Twitter feed. I love it.
It's great. I don't think he has quite as much time to do it now that he's he manages a wearables company. Now he's part of a startup, but when he was a scientist, he had more free time to tweet silly things. Anyway, I don't think that there's one marker, and unfortunately, I can't just give you a checklist to work off of.
Yeah, I guess that is the challenge, that, you know, a lot of this does seem to rely on, you know, people who already do have a degree of scientific literacy and ability to just sort of wade through things. So the challenge is really getting to the people who lack that information and finding simple ways for them to wade through it.
Yeah, I mean, at one point I was like, okay, so if for someone who doesn't have my background and who doesn't have my skill set, how long would it take them to do something that I do? And I genuinely tried to think out like a way that you could have a checklist. You could just go through a news article or a piece of scientific literature and see how reliable it was. And I realized that the amount of time you'd have to invest just in understanding the basics probably makes it like too time consuming for your average person. So I don't think that there's an easy solution to poor scientific reporting, unfortunately. I don't know. It's always good to be skeptical, I guess, which is why we're all here. I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure.
Oh, of course. Okay, so the next question is there a good simple resource to point people to if they refer to the IVM Meta website?
We're trying to put one together is the short answer. It is incredibly time consuming to answer IVM Meta, although actually recently Scott Alexander, who's a psychiatrist in the United States, put together a very comprehensive like 5,000 word post on IVM Meta, which I tweeted out, so you can check my feed to have a look at that. which answers a lot of the questions about the website or my Twitter feed.
One thing I've noticed is that it always seems to be really useful to kind of hold on until someone forgets to renew their ownership of a domain and then something reliable.
Yeah, look, I have to say they appear to be extremely well coordinated and extremely well funded. Whoever's behind this has quite a lot of money. So, or they have the dedicated man hours of hundreds of people. So I don't expect that sort of thing is going to be very effective. They seem to be extremely well organized.
Okay, so next question is, what is the simple conclusion on ivermectin? Is it finally safe to say that there's zero evidence that it provides any positive effect?
No. I mean, I was actually thinking about it. It's not safe to say that. I was thinking about this yesterday. So, for example, the prophylaxis literature, there are 3 randomized control trials. One is El Ghazar had a prophylaxis arm that's been retracted. One of the studies says it's randomized, but also said that it stopped allocating patients into their intervention arm at some point. So it's not actually randomized. Sorry, stopped allocating patients into their control arm at one point, but still analyzed everyone as if it was an RCT. So it's not actually an RCT. And the third one, the authors report a massive benefit, but refuse any attempts to contact them. And they have many mistakes in their paper as well. And then aside from those 3 RCTs, there's about a dozen truly atrocious observational and ecological trials. So for prophylaxis, I think we can reasonably say that there is absolutely no evidence that ivermectin either works or doesn't work. That we just have no basis for saying that it has that we know anything about that question. We just don't know. For treatment, it is becoming slowly more clear that there cannot be a large benefit. There is still plausibly a small benefit. And until we get the results from a few bigger trials that are set to report soon, we won't know.
All right. Just one last question, actually, from me. You talked about the fact that there's now been this kind of statement that ivermectin shouldn't be used outside of clinical trials, for COVID. But I guess what I worry about as a bioethicist is around the fact that even in the clinical trial setting, we want research to be done that is actually driven with good scientific questions. So, how do we then deal with the fact that, the research itself may be problematic, and the people who are then participating are then put at risk, even though it's asking a research question?
So I think from an ethical perspective, it is challenging because on the one hand, there is a kind of moral imperative to provide evidence on ivermectin because it is being used by people around the globe as we speak. There will be people harmed if it is not effective, and we need to know if it is effective. If it is effective, then as I said, it's safe. It should be used, and so that's a fantastic thing. But we are accumulating more and more evidence that it may not work. And in that context, is it ethical to start new trials testing a treatment that does appear more and more to be ineffective? And I think in the current context, the most ethical choice we can make is to say there are ongoing large clinical trials which have already randomized people, and those ones should continue. We probably shouldn't start new randomized clinical trials, and no one else should receive the drug outside of that context because we don't know if it works or not, and we may be harming people.
That's great. That's really helpful. All right. Look, I think we've actually just about come to time. I'll just see if there are, I think that's the last question. So thank you so much for a really fantastic talk and providing some really useful information on such a topical issue.
That was my absolute pleasure. Great to be here.